Imagine taking a massive, unexpected body blow, like it catches you completely off guard, breaks your stance, maybe fractures your ribs, and leaves you just wobbling there.
Right. Desperately trying to catch your breath.
Exactly. You are entirely defenseless. And then, exactly 39 seconds later, before you can even register that first hit, a knockout punch lands with even greater force.
Yeah, that's a terrifying thought.
And it isn't a boxing match. That is the actual geological reality of what just happened to hundreds of people in South America. And, it completely defies how we usually think about natural disasters. So welcome to the Daily Deep Dive, or 3D, initiative of UPSC with Sarab Kaushik.
Glad to be here.
We take a mountain of crucial updates, strip away the noise, and get straight to the signal. Today's index is an absolute marathon for you guys. We've got 16 distinct updates.
It's a huge list.
Oh yeah, let me just run through them fast. We're tracking the Venezuela doublet earthquake, Samvithan Hachediwas, the Nitra AEWNC operational clearance, the new IB chief appointment, the Mahadai River dispute, FCRA rules, passport citizenship laws, ultrasound laws, CCPA fines, trauma care systems, construction corruption, the RBI's digital fraud rules, the BRICS energy ministers meeting, LPG restoration, the RPM scheme, and finally, updates on the Mumbai Port and Telecom Act portal.
I mean, it is a formidable map of the world today. We are crossing geography, internal security, polity, the economy, and really the bleeding edge of the law.
Yeah. And while that index holds 16 items, our mission is to extract the most crucial, high-leverage knowledge from the 14 deeply detailed sections in our source material. So we are going to connect the dots serially, basically shortcutting your path to being incredibly well-informed without the overwhelming flood of raw data.
Sounds good.
So let's jump straight into that opening scenario. On June 24th, 2026, a devastating tragedy struck northern Venezuela. 188 people confirmed dead, over 1,500 injured. But the science behind this is what makes it so uniquely terrifying. It was a 7.2 foreshock, followed just 39 seconds later by a 7.5 main shock near Moran.
Right. And what's fascinating here is the specific geological phenomenon at play. It's known as a doublet earthquake.
Okay, let's unpack this, because usually it's just one big quake, right?
Exactly. To understand why this maximizes destruction, we need to look at seismic mechanics. Doublets are, well, they're statistical anomalies. They make up only about 1% to 2% of all significant earthquakes globally.
Wow, so very rare.
Very rare. Our standard understanding involves a massive main shock, followed by days or weeks of slowly diminishing aftershocks as the plates settle. But in a doublet, you have two earthquakes of comparable magnitude, meaning they are within roughly 0.5 magnitude of each other.
Which is huge.
Yeah, and they occur incredibly close together in both space and time.
That 39-second window is what really haunts me. Let's break down what is happening to the physical infrastructure in that half minute. The first 7.2 magnitude shock hits. It doesn't necessarily flatten the city, but it compromises the structural integrity of the concrete, right?
That is the mechanical reality, yes. The first shock flexes the buildings beyond their elastic limit. The concrete cracks, the rebar inside the pillars is stretched and stressed, and the microfractures propagate through the foundations.
So they're still standing, but barely.
Exactly. They might still be standing, but they possess zero residual capacity to resist further lateral forces. So when the 7.5 main shock hits seconds later, those weakened structures simply fold.
Just collapse completely.
Yeah. And from a human behavior standpoint, it is a perfect storm for casualties. When the ground shakes, human instinct dictates fleeing outside. In a doublet, people who survive that first shock are in motion.
Oh, man. They're in the stairwells.
Right. They are caught in stairwells, crowding in doorways, or running out onto the street right under falling glass and masonry, just as the second, more powerful shock brings the entire weakened structure down.
Which means the casualty rate just scales exponentially compared to a single shock. I noticed our notes mention the USGS using a pager model for this. How does that calculate the human cost so quickly?
So the PAGER system, it stands for Prompt Assessment of Global Earthquakes for Response. It doesn't just look at magnitude. It overlays the seismic footprint of the quake onto highly detailed maps of human population density and, critically, local building codes.
Okay, so it knows what kind of buildings are there.
Exactly. It looks at the vulnerability of the building stock. Given Venezuela's economic challenges and the prevalence of unreinforced masonry, the PAGER model estimated a high probability of fatalities running into the thousands once the rubble is finally cleared.
Let's dig into the geology of why this specific region snapped so violently. We are talking about the Caribbean plate, and the South American plate. I always picture tectonic plates crashing head-on, but this is a different mechanism, isn't it?
It is. It's fundamentally different from what we see in the Himalayas or Japan.
Hmm.
Northern Venezuela sits on a transpressional boundary, specifically the Boconó-San Sebastián-El Pilar fault system.
That's a long name.
Yeah, it's a massive 1,300-kilometer geological scar. Unlike a subduction zone where one plate dives beneath another, causing massive vertical displacement and tsunamis, this is a strike-slip fault. The Caribbean plate and the South American plate are just grinding past each other horizontally.
So picture two massive rough blocks of concrete pressed tightly together, and some unimaginable force is trying to slide them sideways in opposite direction.
And a very apt visualization. And they don't slide smoothly. The friction snags them. The plates keep pushing at a rate of about 2 centimeters a year, which is remarkably similar to the famous San Andreas fault in California.
Right, so the pressure just builds and builds.
Over decades, immense elastic strain builds up in the rock. When the rock finally fails and overcomes that friction, it violently snaps forward, releasing all that pent-up energy as seismic waves. In this case, the first snap transferred stress further down the fault line, triggering the second rupture almost instantly.
Which brings us to the most actionable takeaway for anyone listening, especially here in India. Venezuela lacked an earthquake early warning system. Compare that to Japan's J alert or Mexico's SASMEX. In this specific doublet scenario, could a warning system have actually saved lives with only a 39-second gap?
Oh, it could have changed the fatality metrics significantly. Early warning systems don't predict earthquakes, right? They detect the very first fast-moving P waves of a quake that has already started.
And those P waves travel faster than the destructive waves.
Yes. They instantly transmit a warning faster than the damaging, slower-moving S waves can travel through the crust. Even 10 to 15 seconds of warning allows automated systems to halt trains, shut down gas lines, and, gives people time to drop, cover, and hold on under a sturdy desk, rather than rushing into a deadly stairwell.
And looking at our own vulnerability, India has vast regions designated as Zone V. That's the highest seismic risk, stretching across the entire Himalayan belt, the Northeast, and Kutch. The Indian plate is relentlessly pushing into the Eurasian plate. Where do we stand on early warnings?
We are still developing a comprehensive nationwide public alert system for ground shaking. We have a world-class Indian Ocean tsunami warning system established after the 2004 disaster.
Right, but for land?
For terrestrial quakes in the Himalayas, the National Center for Polar and Ocean Research and the IMD are actively working on sensor grids. The challenge is the proximity of major cities to the fault lines. The closer you are to the epicenter, the less warning time the physics of the system can offer.
It is a sobering reality that geological fault lines can fracture the earth beneath us without warning. But what happens when historical political fault lines fracture the foundational rights of a nation? That brings us to our next major analysis. June 25th marked the 51st anniversary of the emergency, proclaimed by Prime Minister Indira Gandhi back in 1975.
Yes, a very significant date.
And the current government recently officially renamed what was informally known as Black Day to Samvidhan Hatya Diwas, which translates to Constitution Murder Day.
Right. And to deeply understand the weight of this commemoration, we must look impartially at the constitutional mechanisms that were manipulated during those 21 months from June 1975 to March 1977.
Okay.
The emergency was declared under Article 352 of the Constitution. At that time, the phrasing in the Constitution allowed for a national emergency to be declared on the grounds of internal disturbance. It was a dangerously broad term.
And the immediate domino effect of that declaration was the suspension of fundamental rights. The state suddenly had the power to act without the usual checks and balances.
Exactly. The state utilized draconian preventive detention laws, primarily MISA, that's the Maintenance of Internal Security Act, and the DIR, the Defense of India rules. These allowed the government to arrest political opponents, journalists, labor leaders, and student activists without trial.
Just swept them up.
Yeah, the fundamental rights guaranteed under Articles 19, 20, and 21 were effectively suspended, silencing free speech, assembly, and personal liberty.
I want to spend some time on the 42nd Amendment, passed in 1976 during the height of the emergency. Our notes describe it as attempting to completely rewrite the constitutional rulebook. What were the specific mechanics of that amendment?
The 42nd Amendment is often referred to as a mini-constitution because of its vast scope. While it is most famous for adding the words socialist, secular, and integrity to the preamble, its true impact was an unprecedented centralization of power.
How so?
Well, it explicitly attempted to make constitutional amendments non-justiciable.
Meaning the government could change the Constitution however they wanted, and the Supreme Court wouldn't be allowed to review or strike it down.
That was the intent. It was a direct assault on the power of judicial review. Furthermore, it extended the term of the Lok Sabha and state assemblies from 5 years to 6, effectively delaying elections.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and it subordinated fundamental rights to directive principles. The subsequent Janata Party government, through the 44th Amendment in 1978, worked systematically to dismantle these centralizations.
Let's look at how the 44th Amendment actually fixed those vulnerabilities. If internal disturbance was the loophole, how did they close it?
They replaced internal disturbance with the much more stringent requirement of armed rebellion. So a peaceful protest can no longer be grounds for an emergency.
That makes a lot of sense.
The 44th Amendment also introduced the safeguard that the president could only declare an emergency upon receiving a written recommendation from the Union Cabinet, preventing a prime minister from acting unilaterally. It restored the 5-year term of the Lok Sabha and reinstated the power of judicial review.
The evolution of Article 21, the right to life and personal liberty, is perhaps the most fascinating legal arc here. During the emergency, the Supreme Court handed down the infamous ADM Jabalpur verdict. Can we break down what the court actually said in that ruling? Because it sounds almost dystopian to me.
The ADM Jabalpur case, often called the habeas corpus case, is widely considered the lowest point in India's judicial history. The majority bench ruled that during a proclaimed emergency, a citizen's right to life and liberty under Article 21 is completely suspended.
Completely suspended. So if the state detains you...
You do not even have the right to file a writ of habeas corpus to ask a judge if your detention is lawful. The state's power to detain became absolute and unquestionable.
So we could simply vanish into the prison system, and the courts declared themselves powerless to even ask why?
Yes. Only Justice H.R. Khanna dissented, arguing famously that the right to life predates the Constitution and cannot be entirely subsumed by the state, even in an emergency. It took decades for the jurisprudence to self-correct. Fast forward to 2017, the landmark Puttaswamy ruling, which affirmed the fundamental right to privacy, took the explicit step of officially overruling the ADM Jabalpur decision.
Which means today, thanks to the 44th Amendment and rulings like Puttaswamy, your right to life and personal liberty under Articles 20 and 21 can never be suspended, no matter what crisis the nation faces. The Constitution has evolved to protect citizens from internal state overreach.
Absolutely.
But guarding a nation's sovereignty also requires immense technological capability against external threats.
Yeah.
So let's pivot from the legal defense of the nation to its physical defense in the skies. On June 25, 2026, the DRDO officially handed over the final operational clearance for the Nitra AEW&C system to the Indian Air Force.
This represents a massive leap in India's defense indigenization. Nutra translates to eye in Sanskrit, which perfectly describes an airborne early warning and control system. It is the IAF's sovereign eye in the sky.
Sounds intense. What are these mounted on?
These systems are mounted on highly modified Embraer ERJ-145 regional jets, and this newly cleared fleet is stationed with the 200 Squadron at Bathinda, Punjab, providing critical coverage over the western sector.
Now, a listener might be wondering, we have massive radar installations on the ground, high up in the mountains with practically unlimited power supplies. Why go through the immense engineering headache of shrinking a radar down, strapping it to the roof of a commercial jet, and flying it around? What does Nutra see that a mountain radar cannot?
It comes down to the fundamental geometry of the Earth. A ground-based radar, no matter how technologically advanced or powerful, operates strictly on a line of sight. It emits electromagnetic waves that travel in straight lines. But the Earth is curved.
Right, so there's a blind spot.
This creates a radar horizon. If an adversary launches a low-flying cruise missile or sends fighter jets hugging the terrain through valleys, they remain beneath the ground radar's line of sight. The ground station simply won't see them until they pop up over the horizon, which might only be a few dozen kilometers away.
By which point it is far too late to scramble a defense.
Exactly the problem. By taking that radar and elevating it to 30,000 feet on an aircraft, you defeat the curvature of the Earth. You are looking down on the airspace. Suddenly, your radar horizon expands to 400 or 500 kilometers.
That's incredible.
You can detect low-flying threats deep inside enemy airspace the moment they take off.
I love this concept. It's like taking the air traffic control tower from an airport, giving it wings, and then crossing it with a tactical battlefield chess master. Because Nutra isn't just passively watching. The C stands for control, right?
It is a flying command center. The heart of the Nutra is its active electronically scanned array, or AESA radar. To appreciate this technology, consider a traditional radar like the spinning dish you see at an airport or on an old ship. It mechanically rotates to sweep the sky, which takes several seconds per rotation.
Okay, yeah, I can picture that.
An ESA radar, however, has no moving parts. It consists of hundreds of tiny, solid-state transmit and receive modules fixed in a plank-like structure on top of the jet.
If it doesn't spin, how does it scan the sky?
Through a process called phase shifting. By slightly altering the timing, the phase of the radio waves emitted by each of those hundreds of individual modules, the radar can steer the combined beam of energy electronically.
So it's just software directing the beam?
Essentially, yes. It can point the beam in one direction and a microsecond later point it in a completely different direction. This allows Nutra to track hundreds of fast-moving targets simultaneously, resist enemy electronic jamming, and focus intense radar energy on specific threats without ever moving a physical dish. It provides roughly 240 degrees of coverage.
How does this indigenous Netra compare to the Israeli Falcon AWACS that the Indian Air Force also operates?
They serve complementary roles within a larger network. The Falcon system is mounted on a massive Russian IL-76 heavy transport aircraft. It features a large rotating dome that houses its AESA radar, giving it full 360-degree coverage and a somewhat longer detection range due to sheer size and power generation. However, the Falcon is heavy, expensive to operate, and requires massive runways.
Whereas the Netra is nimble.
The Netra is built on a smaller jet platform. It is much cheaper to operate, highly flexible, and most importantly, it is indigenous. It proves that India possesses the incredibly complex system integration capabilities required to fuse AESA radars, secure data links, electronic warfare suites, and command consoles into a flying platform.
So they work together in a combat scenario.
Exactly. In a high-end conflict, a Falcon might act as the deep-look central node, while multiple Netras orbit closer to the borders, covering the flanks and directing localized fighter intercepts.
And this isn't theoretical capability. The notes highlight that Nutra has a combat-proven pedigree. It was deployed during the 2019 Balakot strikes to monitor Pakistani airspace. And more recently, during Operation Sindoor in 2025, it played a critical role. It didn't just track enemy scrambles. It actively guided IAF fighters to optimal intercept vectors in real time while detecting enemy radar emissions.
It's a game changer for sure.
Keeping a technological eye in the sky is critical for external threats. But keeping an ear to the ground for internal threats requires a completely different kind of mastery, and that's human intelligence.
Right.
Let's look at a major shift in the architecture of India's internal security. The Appointments Committee of the Cabinet has approved Mahesh Dixit, a 1993 batch IPS officer, as the new director of the Intelligence Bureau.
Succeeding Tapan Deka, this is arguably one of the most consequential bureaucratic appointments the state can make. The Intelligence Bureau, or IB, is India's premier domestic intelligence agency. Established in 1887, it is actually one of the oldest continuing intelligence organizations in the world.
Let's clarify the architecture here for the listener. We hear about the IB, we hear about RAW. Who does what, and who reports to whom?
A simple way to divide it is by borders. The Research and Analysis Wing, RAW, is responsible for foreign intelligence gathering. It operates outside India's borders and reports directly to the Prime Minister's office.
Okay, so RAW is external.
Right. The IB, on the other hand, is focused squarely on internal security within India's borders, and it functions under the Ministry of Home Affairs.
So if a listener wonders how the director of the IB impacts their daily life, the answer is that the IB is the invisible shield operating in the background of their cities. What is the day-to-day mandate of the Bureau?
The mandate is vast. The primary directive is counterterrorism, identifying, infiltrating, and dismantling domestic terror modules before they can execute attacks. But it extends deeply into counterinsurgency, particularly monitoring and disrupting left-wing extremism or Naxalism across the central and eastern states.
They also handle counterespionage, right? Catching foreign spies operating on Indian soil.
Yes. They monitor foreign intelligence operatives attempting to turn Indian assets. Furthermore, the IB is responsible for VIP security threat assessments, evaluating the risk levels for political leaders and critical infrastructure. Even the background verification process for sensitive government appointments, judges, and high-level clearances flows through the IB's vetting procedures.
So when the Appointments Committee, which consists of the Prime Minister and the Home Minister, selects Mahesh Dixit for this role, they are choosing the individual who will walk into their office every morning and brief them on the most sensitive, immediate, and volatile threats to the fabric of the nation.
It's an immense responsibility.
It requires an absolute mastery of police coordination because the ID itself doesn't typically make arrests, do they?
The IB is an intelligence gathering organization. They collect the data, analyze the patterns, and generate actionable intelligence. They then must coordinate seamlessly with state police forces, the anti-terrorism squads, or central agencies like the NIA to actually execute the operations and make the arrests. The director must navigate the complex federal structure of India, maintaining relationships with every state's Director General of Police.
Monitoring internal conflict is a monumental task. And what's fascinating is that the most complex internal conflicts a nation faces aren't always about terrorism or extremism. Very often, the most bitter battles are fought over fundamental resources, specifically water. Which brings us to the Mahadai River dispute. The center has just proposed a disputes resolution committee to try and resolve a massive tri-state water war between Goa, Karnataka, and Maharashtra.
This dispute perfectly illustrates how geography and the absolute necessity of water can completely paralyze political and legal systems. The Mahadai, which is also known as the Mandovi River in Goa, is relatively short, only about 160 kilometers long.
Right.
It originates in the western Ghats of Karnataka. But the vast majority of its basin and its flow run through Goa before emptying into the Arabian Sea.
For Goa, this river is everything. It is their ecological heart, it sustains their agriculture, and it is the backbone of their inland waterways and tourism.
Conversely, Karnataka has an equally desperate need. The dispute centers on Karnataka's proposed Malanadi project. They want to build dams and canals to divert water from the Mahadai Basin into the Malaprabha River Basin. Their argument is grounded in basic human survival. They need that diverted water to provide drinking water to the rapidly expanding twin cities of Hubli-Dharwad and the surrounding drought-prone districts.
So you have an existential clash. Karnataka argues for the fundamental right to drinking water for massive urban populations. Goa argues that diverting that water will increase salinity, destroy the Western Ghats ecology, and cripple its economy. Let's look at the legal framework for this, because our Constitution has specific tools for interstate water wars.
Under the 7th schedule of the Constitution, water is a state list subject, specifically Entry 17. States generally have full control over water supplies, irrigation, and canals within their borders. However, because rivers don't respect political boundaries, interstate rivers and river valleys are placed under the Union list, Entry 56.
Makes sense since they flow across borders.
Exactly. The framers recognized that states would inevitably fight over shared rivers.
And to handle those fights, they drafted Article 262. I read the notes on this, and it is a surprisingly aggressive piece of constitutional law.
Article 262 is unique. It empowers Parliament to adjudicate disputes over the use, distribution, or control of interstate rivers. But the critical clause is that Parliament may, by law, explicitly provide that neither the Supreme Court nor any other court shall exercise jurisdiction in respect of any such dispute.
Wait, Parliament can write a law that literally locks the Supreme Court out of hearing a major constitutional conflict between states. Why would the framers intentionally remove the highest court from the equation?
The rationale was that water disputes are deeply technical, heavily reliant on hydrological data, historical usage patterns, and complex engineering, rather than just pure legal interpretation. The framers believed that specialized tribunals, comprising engineers and subject matter experts alongside judges, would be better equipped to divide resources equitably to the traditional courtroom.
So Parliament enacted the Interstate Water Disputes Act of 1956 to create these tribunals. How did that work out for the Mahadai?
Well, the Center constituted the Mahadai Water Disputes Tribunal in 2010. After 8 years of exhaustive hearings and technical surveys, the tribunal gave its final award in 2018. It allocated specific amounts of water, measured in TMC feet, to Karnataka, Goa, and Maharashtra.
But I'm guessing nobody was happy?
As is almost always the case with these tribunals. We have seen identical patterns with the Kaveri and Krishna River disputes. The states immediately challenge the award. They file clarification petitions, they attempt to invoke the Supreme Court's inherent jurisdiction under Article 136, and the implementation stalls for decades.
We pride ourselves on keeping this analysis strictly neutral and apolitical, but one simply must observe the fascinating dynamic playing out here. Both Goa and Karnataka are currently governed by the same national political party. Yet they remain locked in a fierce, uncompromising legal battle against each other. It proves that when a resource like water is at stake, local geography and economic survival will always override broader political alliances.
Which is precisely why the center is trying a new approach. Rather than relying solely on adversarial tribunals that take decades, they are proposing a Disputes Resolution Committee, a DRC, under a newer amendment framework.
Oh, so trying to get them to just talk it out?
Basically, the goal is to bring independent technical experts into a room with the states to attempt scientific mediation and find a negotiated middle ground before dragging the conflict back into endless litigation.
It is a desperate attempt to regulate the flow of a vital resource and maintain balance between states. And just as the government heavily regulates the flow of interstate rivers, it also deploys complex legal machinery to regulate the flow of international funding into domestic organizations. Let's analyze the recent Foreign Contribution Regulation Act, or FCRA, rules.
The FCRA is the statutory framework governing how non-governmental organizations, NGOs, charities, and civil society groups can receive and utilize foreign donations. Our source material includes a detailed editorial analysis focusing on a striking trend. The sheer number of FCRA-registered NGOs in India has contracted massively.
How massive are we talking?
The data shows a drop of roughly 30%, falling from around 22,000 active registrations in 2020 to just 15,500 in 2026.
A contraction of that magnitude reshapes the entire landscape of civil society. To understand this, we need to examine the two entirely distinct narratives driving this debate, and we will look at both with absolute neutrality. Let's start with the state's rationale. Why are the rules being tightened so aggressively?
The state's position is anchored in the concept of national sovereignty and the foreign hand doctrine. The core argument asserts that unregulated foreign funding, especially massive influxes of capital from international foundations, foreign governments, or global pressure groups, creates a severe vulnerability.
How so?
The state argues that these funds can be weaponized to interfere in India's domestic affairs, manipulate political discourse, stall critical infrastructure projects through funded activism, and impact internal security.
So the government views the FCRA as a national security filter, ensuring that foreign money isn't dictating domestic policy.
Correct. Over the years, the amendments have mandated stricter reporting, tighter end-use monitoring, a prohibition on subgranting funds to smaller NGOs, and the requirement to route all foreign funds through a single designated SBI branch in New Delhi to centralize oversight.
Now let's look at the counter-argument presented in the editorial. What is the cost of this security filter?
The editorial contends that the regulatory net is cast far too wide, resulting in disproportionate collateral damage. While acknowledging the need to stop malicious interference, the editorial argues that the labyrinthine compliance requirements are strangling legitimate, apolitical NGOs.
Like the ones doing actual charity work.
Exactly. Organizations doing critical, ground-level work in rural healthcare, tribal education, legal aid for the marginalized, and disaster relief are being starved of essential funding because of minor technical infractions or delayed renewals.
The notes mention high-profile cases like Amnesty International, Greenpeace, and Oxfam facing severe restrictions.
Yes. The editorial argues that the cumulative effect of the 2020 amendments and the subsequent 2026 rules is a systematic narrowing of the space for civil society in India, creating a chilling effect where organizations are too afraid of losing their registration to engage in meaningful rights-based advocacy.
This clash between national security and civil society operations inevitably ended up in the Supreme Court. Let's discuss the 2022 Noel-Harper judgment because it defines the legal reality of this entire issue. Did the court view receiving foreign funds as a right?
The Supreme Court's ruling was decisive. In the Noel-Harper case, the court upheld the constitutional validity of the FCRA amendments. Crucially, the bench explicitly ruled that receiving foreign contributions is not an absolute right, nor is it a fundamental right protected under Article 19(1)(c), which guarantees the right to form associations.
Wait, if the Supreme Court says it isn't a fundamental right, doesn't that give the state a blank check to shut down anyone they choose simply by revoking their FCRA license?
The court affirmed that the state has the sovereign authority to heavily regulate or even prohibit foreign money if it deems it necessary to protect the nation's democratic values from external influence. A statutory right to receive funds is subject to the conditions laid down by Parliament. However, the court did add a note of caution, stating that the regulatory regime should not become so oppressive that it arbitrarily stifles legitimate charitable work.
But the editorial argues that it has become oppressive. What solution do they propose to bridge this gap?
The primary structural recommendation in the editorial is the creation of an independent FCRA oversight body or tribunal. Currently, the entire process, registrations, suspensions, and cancellations, is managed entirely within the Ministry of Home Affairs.
Oh, so it's all handled by the security apparatus.
Right. And if an NGO's license is canceled, their only recourse is to file a writ in the high courts, which can take years to resolve while their operations die. An independent tribunal, separate from the MHA, could evaluate cases more transparently, differentiating rapidly between NGOs engaged in political subversion and those merely struggling with accounting compliance.
It is a delicate balancing act. The state must regulate the health of the political ecosystem. But in our next topic, we see the state struggling to regulate actual physical health care because of the blinding speed of technological advancement. Let's look at the PCP-NDT Act and how modern ultrasound laws are essentially breaking down.
The Preconception and Prenatal Diagnostic Techniques Act of 1994 was a landmark, desperately needed piece of legislation. It was designed with one urgent societal goal: to halt the epidemic of sex-selective abortions that was devastating India's demographics.
Right.
And to a certain extent, when combined with massive social campaigns like Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao, the law has had a positive impact. The child sex ratio has shown improvement, moving from 918 girls per 1,000 boys in 2011 to 933 in the 2021 census projections.
Which is progress, absolutely. But a ratio of 933 is still artificially skewed compared to the natural biological baseline of around 943 to 950. The core issue outlined in our notes, however, isn't just enforcement. It is that the law itself is becoming scientifically obsolete.
That is the crux of the crisis. The entire enforcement architecture, the bureaucracy, and the penal codes of the PCP-NDT Act are built entirely around one piece of technology: the ultrasound machine.
The physical machine in the clinic.
Yes, the law mandates that every single sonography machine must be registered, every clinic must maintain meticulous auditable records of every scan, and it imposes severe criminal penalties on any doctor who discloses the sex of the fetus, which an ultrasound can typically visualize around the 15 to 20-week mark.
The law successfully built a fortress around the ultrasound clinic. But modern science just invented a teleporter. Let's talk about NIPT. What is this technology, and how does it bypass the law so effortlessly?
NIPT stands for non-invasive prenatal testing. It represents a massive leap in genomics. NIPT is not a scan. It is a simple blood test drawn from the pregnant mother's arm. To understand how it works, we have to look at the biology of pregnancy. During gestation, a small fraction of the DNA circulating in the mother's bloodstream is not her own. It is cell-free fetal DNA shed by the placenta.
So the baby's genetic code is literally floating in the mother's blood.
Exactly. By drawing a vial of the mother's blood, a highly advanced genetic laboratory can sequence those circulating fragments of fetal DNA. They look for specific chromosomal markers, primarily to screen for genetic abnormalities like Down syndrome, but inherently, this sequencing also reveals the presence or absence of a Y chromosome. If a Y chromosome is detected in the mother's blood, the fetus is male. If not, it's female.
And the timeline is what makes this so legally disruptive. An ultrasound needs 15 weeks to see the anatomy. When can an NIPT test determine the sex?
NIPT can determine the sex of the fetus with over 99% accuracy at just 7 weeks into the pregnancy.
7 weeks. That is a paradigm shift. It completely bypasses the heavily regulated ultrasound clinic. You don't need a registered sonographer. You don't need a bulky machine. You just need a technician to draw blood and a courier to send it to a lab. It's like the police setting up a roadblock to catch speeding cars, and the suspect simply flies over them in a drone. The legislation is looking in the wrong place.
And that is exactly what legal experts are warning about. The testing is rapidly moving out of the visible, regulated clinical setting and into unregulated blood collection centers, private pathology labs, and even online services where samples are shipped internationally to jurisdictions where sex determination is legal.
So what's the fix?
The legal framework must urgently be expanded. It cannot just regulate sonography equipment. It must comprehensively regulate all fetal genetic testing, the transport of biological samples, and the laboratories conducting the sequencing. Otherwise, the hard-won progress in the child sex ratio could easily be reversed by invisible, untraceable blood tests.
It is a profound example of the law playing catch-up with science, and we see that same dynamic playing out in consumer protection. The law is finally catching up with the clever, evasive tactics of modern marketing. Let's shift to our 8th topic. The Central Consumer Protection Authority, the CCPA, has just levied a fine of 3 lakh rupees each on Amul and a major juice brand. Why? Because they plastered 100% pure on the front of their packaging while burying all the caveats, additives, and exceptions in microscopic text on the back.
This enforcement action sets a critical legal precedent under the Consumer Protection Act of 2019. For decades, the processed food industry has operated comfortably within a specific regulatory loophole. The Food Safety and Standards Authority of India, FSSAI, correctly mandates that all ingredients must be accurately listed on the product. But that list is invariably buried on the back of the pack, written in technical jargon and tiny font.
While the front of the pack, the part the consumer actually sees on the shelf, is treated like a lawless billboard, covered in massive claims like 100% natural, 0% fat, or immunity boosting.
The industry relied on the defense that as long as the truth was technically printed somewhere on the back, the bold claims on the front couldn't be classified as illegal. The CCPA has decisively rejected that defense. They ruled that a disclaimer on the back of a package does not cure a misleading, absolute claim made on the front.
I think every single person listening has experienced this. You are rushing through the grocery store after a long day. You grab a juice box for your kid because it screams 100% pure fruit juice in huge, colorful letters. You don't have the time or a magnifying glass to flip it over, read the fine print, and realize it is actually 10% fruit concentrate, 80% water, and loaded with added sugar and artificial flavoring. The CCPA is essentially saying that this standard consumer experience is legally deceptive.
The ruling is clear. If a product claims to be 100% pure on the front label, it must genuinely, unequivocally be 100% pure without qualification. If it contains preservatives, artificial flavors, or reconstitution, making that absolute front-of-pack claim is a per se violation of the statutory prohibition against unfair trade practices and misleading advertisements.
It is a significant victory for consumer transparency, but it also highlights how far behind India is in systemic food labeling regulations compared to the rest of the world.
We are lagging significantly. If you examine the regulatory environment in the European Union or parts of Latin America like Chile, they have implemented incredibly strict, mandatory front-of-pack, or 4P, regulations. Health claims are rigidly defined by law, and products high in sugar or sodium must carry prominent, unmissable warning labels on the front.
We don't have that yet.
FSSAI in India has been drafting and debating HFSS, high-fat, sugar, salt, warning labels for years. But industry pushback has delayed comprehensive rollout. Until those codified FLP regulations are enacted, aggressive CCPA enforcement using the broader Consumer Protection Act is acting as the necessary stopgap to hold corporations accountable.
And while those misleading food labels cause slow, chronic health issues over decades, India is simultaneously facing an acute, immediate, and massive crisis in emergency health responses. Let's look at the devastating numbers behind our next topic, the severe lack of trauma care systems in India. The statistics are horrifying. India witnesses approximately 1.7 lakh road accident deaths annually. We hold the grim title of having the highest number of road fatalities globally. And yet, the notes indicate that only 7 states have managed to fully operationalize level I trauma centers.
To grasp the magnitude of this systemic failure, you have to understand the fundamental biological principle of emergency medicine known as the golden hour. If a victim suffers severe polytrauma, meaning a traumatic brain injury, massive internal hemorrhaging, or complex compound fractures, their survival is a race against physiological collapse.
You literally have 60 minutes.
Exactly. If they receive definitive specialized surgical intervention within 60 minutes of the injury, their chances of survival and avoiding permanent debilitating paralysis increase exponentially.
But the reality on Indian highways is that reaching a facility capable of that level of intervention within 60 minutes is almost impossible for the vast majority of citizens.
Because the infrastructure simply does not exist. A level I trauma center is not merely a hospital emergency room with a few extra beds. It is a massive, highly integrated ecosystem. It requires the 247 in-house, immediate availability of highly specialized surgical teams, neurosurgeons, orthopedic specialists, vascular surgeons, and anesthesiologists. It requires dedicated trauma-intensive care units, continuous and immediate CT scanner access, a massive fully stocked blood bank, and ideally, helipads for rapid air evacuation.
The economics of building that must be staggering.
The capital expenditure required to establish a single-level eye center is estimated between 100 to 150 crore rupees, with massive recurring operational costs. The central government has initiated schemes to fund these centers at state medical colleges along national highways, but state governments consistently drag their feet. They struggle with the capital matching requirements, and more importantly, they face an insurmountable logistical nightmare in staffing them.
Let's talk about that staffing deficit. I was reading that emergency medicine as a distinct clinical specialty wasn't even formally recognized by the Medical Council of India until 2009.
That is a critical bottleneck. We have a severe structural shortage of board-certified emergency medicine specialists. India produces fewer than 1,000 EM residents annually. Consequently, the vast majority of emergency rooms across the country are staffed by general physicians or junior doctors.
Who are trying their best, obviously.
They are dedicated and doing their absolute best, but they simply do not possess the specialized training in advanced trauma life support protocols required to stabilize a patient bleeding out from a crushed pelvis.
We also have to examine the transport link in this chain. Everyone recognizes the 108 ambulance service. You see those vans everywhere. But my understanding is that the physical vehicle is only half the equation. The actual pre-hospital care inside that ambulance is severely lacking.
In emergency medical services, there are two distinct models: scoop and run, where you just load the patient and drive fast, and stay and play, where paramedics perform advanced life support, like intubation, IV fluids, administering emergency drugs before transport. The vast majority of ambulances operating on Indian roads are basic life support vehicles. They are essentially transport vans manned by drivers with minimal first aid training. They lack the advanced equipment and the highly trained paramedics necessary to keep a critically injured patient's airway open and blood pressure stable during that agonizing drive to a distant hospital.
It is a complete systemic failure. The draft National Trauma Policy exists on paper. It mandates response times, outlines the tiered trauma center architecture, and calls for centralized dispatch. But until it is enacted and massively funded, the gap between the policy document and the bleeding asphalt will continue to cost hundreds of thousands of lives. Moving from the physical trauma of our roadways, we pivot to a different kind of trauma that is quietly devastating millions of households: the financial trauma of digital payment scams.
Starting in January 2027, the Reserve Bank of India is implementing a revolutionary set of compensation rules for victims of digital payment fraud. The scale of the problem necessitated this intervention. In the last financial year alone, there were over 13 million reported cases of digital fraud, resulting in a staggering financial loss of roughly 11,000 crore rupees to everyday citizens.
This is a policy shift that directly affects anyone with a smartphone and a bank account. To understand the magnitude of what the RBI is changing, we have to clearly define the difference between unauthorized fraud and authorized fraud under the current banking rules.
Unauthorized fraud is the traditional hacking scenario. A cybercriminal breaches the bank's servers, exploits a vulnerability in the payment gateway, and siphons money out of your account without you ever knowing, participating, or clicking a link. In these instances, existing RBI guidelines generally hold the financial institution liable. The system failed, so the bank must refund the customer.
That makes sense. But hackers rarely use brute force anymore because it's too difficult. The new way of stealing is authorized fraud.
Precisely. Authorized fraud relies entirely on social engineering. The scammer doesn't hack the bank, they hack the human. You receive a frantic phone call from someone impersonating a telecom official threatening to disconnect your number, a police officer claiming your parcel contains illegal goods, or a bank executive warning you of fraudulent charges. They induce blind panic. Under that psychological pressure, they trick you into typing your UPI PIN, sharing an OTP, or authorizing a direct transfer to a safe account.
And under the old paradigm, how did the banks respond when you realized you had been scammed and called them in tears?
The banks relied on a strict interpretation of consent. Their stance was, you entered the PIN. You authorized the transaction on your own device. The system worked exactly as it was designed to. This was your negligence, therefore it is entirely your loss.
And this is where the RBI is finally stepping in and saying, no, that logic is no longer acceptable. If you'll allow me an analogy, the old banking system was acting like a building manager who refuses to fix the broken lock on the front door, refuses to install security cameras, and refuses to hire a guard. When a thief easily walks into the lobby and cons a tenant into handing over their wallet, the building manager just shrugs and blames the tenant for being gullible. Yes, the tenant made a mistake, but the building was structurally inherently unsafe.
That analogy perfectly captures the regulatory shift. The new RBI rules introduce the concept of conditional liability for banks, even in authorized fraud cases. The central bank is mandating that financial institutions and payment aggregators cannot just process transactions blindly. They must actively deploy advanced systemic security measures.
What kind of measures are we talking about? How does a bank stop me from sending my own money to a scammer?
The mandate focuses heavily on AI and network analysis. Banks must deploy algorithms to detect and freeze mule accounts. These are accounts opened with forged KYC documents, existing solely to receive stolen funds and immediately funnel them out through crypto or ATMs. Furthermore, the RBI is mandating transaction speed limiters. If you suddenly try to transfer a massive sum of money to a brand new pay account that you have never interacted with before, the system should flag it, introduce a mandatory cooling-off period, or require secondary verification.
So if I get socially engineered and I send my life savings to a scammer, but the bank failed to deploy these mandated AI safety nets, or they allowed the scammer to operate a glaringly obvious mule account on their platform, what happens?
Under the new 2027 framework, if the bank is found non-compliant with these security mandates, they will now share the liability for the authorized fraud and will be forced to compensate the victim.
That is a massive paradigm shift. It forces the banks to put their own skin in the game regarding cybersecurity, and the operational timelines mentioned in the notes are aggressively pro-consumer.
Very aggressive. Banks will be required to acknowledge the fraud complaint within 24 hours of reporting. And more critically, they must provide interim compensation to the victim within 72 hours while the investigation is ongoing. Their RBI is acknowledging a profound psychological reality. Human beings will always be vulnerable to sophisticated deception and panic. Therefore, the financial infrastructure itself must be resilient enough to catch the fraud in real time. It shifts the burden of defense from consumer education to institutional technology.
Using that building manager metaphor again, the RBI is forcing the system to invest heavily in building better, safer infrastructure. But what happens when actual physical infrastructure is built with a total disregard for safety? That brings us to our 11th topic, exposing the rot in India's construction sector, prompted by the horrific recent fire in Lucknow.
The Lucknow tragedy, which claimed the lives of 15 students in a commercial coaching center, is not an isolated incident. It is the inevitable symptom of systemic, multi-layered corruption within a construction sector that employs roughly 65 million people across the country.
Let's trace the anatomy of a disaster like this. How does a building become a death trap? Where does the chain of oversight break down?
It breaks down at every single level of municipal governance, driven by a highly institutionalized system of bribery. The notes outline the deadly progression. It begins with a contractor seeking to maximize profit margins. They cut corners on structural reinforcement, use substandard electrical wiring, and completely ignore mandates for fire escapes, sprinkler systems, and ventilation.
But a municipal engineer has to inspect the site during construction, right? That's the law.
That is the first point of failure. The engineer is bribed to look the other way and sign off on a fraudulent inspection report. Once the structure is built, it requires a no-objection certificate, an NOC, from the fire department before it can open to the public. The fire officer is subsequently bribed to issue a fake NOC, officially certifying a building as safe despite lacking even basic fire extinguishers or emergency exits. Finally, based on these fraudulent documents, the local civic body grants the occupation certificate.
And the people who pay the immediate price for this corruption are the laborers building it. We have specific legislation for this, don't we? The BOCW Act.
The Building and Other Construction Workers Act of 1996 was intended to be a robust safety net. It levies a mandatory 1% cess on the total cost of any major construction project. This massive pool of funds is strictly meant to be used for worker welfare, providing safety harnesses, hard hats, medical insurance, and emergency assistance for the millions of informal migrant laborers who build our cities.
But our notes indicate the enforcement of this act is near zero.
It is a catastrophic failure of implementation. Thousands of crores are collected through the cess by state welfare boards, but a fraction is actually disbursed. The safety equipment never reaches the scaffolding. The workers remain unprotected, and the funds languish unspent or are diverted.
So when disasters inevitably occur, a roof collapses, a fire traps dozens, the political blame game begins, a minor official is suspended, and the cycle repeats. What is the actual structural solution to this? Because we have FCRA, the Real Estate Regulatory Authority. Hasn't that cleaned up the sector?
FCRA has been highly effective in protecting the financial interests of residential homebuyers. It ensures transparency in funding, prevents delays, and does mandate a 5-year structural defect liability for the builder. However, FCRA's jurisdiction is heavily focused on residential real estate. It largely ignores commercial buildings, educational hostels, hotels, and industrial sites, which, historically, is exactly where these mass casualty fires and structural collapses occur.
If FCRA isn't the answer, what do the experts recommend?
The consensus among urban planners and safety committees is the absolute necessity of mandatory third-party structural and fire safety audits at multiple stages of construction.
Meaning you remove the local, easily bribed municipal engineer from the equation entirely.
Exactly. You require certification from independent, nationally accredited engineering agencies. Currently, Karnataka is the only state that has implemented a version of this with comprehensive success. Furthermore, there's a growing legal push to change how these disasters are prosecuted. When a building collapses and the investigation reveals a documented paper trail of bribes for fake NOCs, it cannot be treated merely as criminal negligence. Agencies like the Enforcement Director or the CBI need to step in and investigate the financial trail under the Prevention of Money Laundering Act. Confiscating the assets of corrupt officials and builders is the only deterrence that will break the bribery chain.
Building safe domestic infrastructure clearly requires ruthless accountability and systemic cooperation. But powering that massive infrastructure, that requires geopolitical navigation and international cooperation on an unprecedented scale. This leads us to our 12th topic. India recently hosted the 11th BRICS Energy Ministers meeting in Gurugram under its 2026 chairship.
To understand the weight of a BRICS energy summit, you simply have to look at the global math. When the energy ministers of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, along with the newer member states, sit down at a table, they represent nations that consume over 40% of the entire globe's energy. Consequently, they produce roughly 38% of global CO2 emissions.
The decisions they make in that room literally dictate the future climate of the planet. What were the tangible outcomes of this meeting?
The defining outcome was the adoption of the BRICS Clean Energy Charter. This is a comprehensive declaration of intent to aggressively cooperate on transitioning away from traditional fossil fuels. It moves beyond rhetoric into actual technological pathways. The charter outlines joint frameworks for developing green hydrogen supply chains, expanding civilian nuclear energy partnerships, or India's NTPC and Russian state entities are playing significant roles, and critically, securing the supply chains for the critical minerals essential for battery storage, like lithium, cobalt, and graphite.
It's an interesting dynamic because India used this platform not just to negotiate, but to project its own ambitions. The notes mention India highlighting its target of 500 gigawatts of renewable energy capacity by 2030, but one phrase in the agenda really caught my eye. They extensively discussed a post-Hormuz energy security framework. How does a narrow strait in the Middle East dominate the agenda of a BRICS meeting happening in Haryana?
The Strait of Hormuz is the single most critical and vulnerable energy choke point on Earth. Roughly 20% of global petroleum consumption and a massive percentage of liquefied natural gas passes through that narrow waterway between Oman and Iran. Any geopolitical friction, military posturing, or actual conflict in that strait sends immediate shock waves through the global economy, causing massive spikes in freight rates and energy prices.
And the BRICS nations, particularly India and China, are heavily reliant on those imports.
Exactly. The BRICS nations recognize that their continued reliance on imported fossil fuels moving through highly volatile geopolitical choke points is an unacceptable strategic risk. The post-Hormuz framework is a collective realization that true energy security doesn't just mean finding new oil suppliers. It means building resilient, domestic, and regional clean energy systems. The goal is to decouple economic growth from the Middle East geopolitical volatility, ensuring that a conflict in the Gulf doesn't shut down the manufacturing sectors of India, Brazil, or China.
We don't even have to look at theoretical models to see the reality of that risk. The impact of the Strait of Hormuz dictates domestic realities immediately, which brings us to topic 13. The Indian government has just announced the full restoration of non-domestic packaged LPG supplies to pre-crisis levels. This follows the reopening of Qatari shipping routes under the recently signed Muscat Accord.
This is the perfect real-world example of that exact vulnerability. Back in April of 2026, there was a severe, albeit temporary, disruption in shipping through the Strait of Hormuz due to escalating regional tensions. India imports a massive volume of its liquefied petroleum gas, LPG, from Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. When those massive gas carriers couldn't safely transit the strait, the Indian government was forced to implement immediate supply conservation measures to prevent reserve depletion.
But they didn't implement rolling blackouts or cut off household cooking gas, did they?
No, the government fiercely protected domestic household cylinders. The political, social, and nutritional fallout of taking cooking gas out of residential kitchens is simply too high. Therefore, the entire burden of the shortage was shifted to the commercial sector. Non-domestic LPG, the large blue bulk cylinders used by the hospitality industry, was heavily restricted and rationed.
It is the ultimate butterfly effect. A geopolitical standoff thousands of miles away in the Persian Gulf directly decides whether a small dosa joint in Chennai, a massive bakery in Mumbai, or a hospital cafeteria in Delhi can turn on its stoves the next morning. It exposes how terrifyingly vulnerable the commercial engine of the country is to external energy shocks.
It does. Now that the diplomatic efforts, highlighted by the Muscat Accord, have reopened the routes, and the import terminals in Dahej and Mundra are receiving continuous shipments again, the restrictions on commercial cylinders have been lifted. But the crisis proved the exact point debated at the BRICS summit. As an emerging superpower, you cannot remain permanently exposed to fossil fuel supply chains that you do not control.
Which naturally leads us to our 14th and final deep dive topic. The obvious solution to escaping fossil fuel vulnerability is transitioning to green technology, building millions of electric vehicles, erecting massive wind turbines. But here's the catch. Doing that requires a completely different, highly guarded, and monopolized resource. The Ministry of Heavy Industries has just extended the global tender for the REPM scheme.
If we pull back and look at the broader industrial strategy, this scheme is arguably one of the most critical economic policies of the decade. REPM stands for Sintered Rare Earth Permanent Magnet. Specifically, in the context of modern tech, we are talking about neodymium iron boron magnets.
Now, when people hear magnet, they think of the little black squares holding up photos on their refrigerator. But these are entirely different beasts, aren't they?
Entirely different. Neodymium magnets are the absolute lifeblood of high-efficiency modern technology. They generate incredibly powerful magnetic fields relative to their small size and weight. To understand why they are so vital, consider an electric vehicle. You need a motor that is light enough to not drain the battery, but powerful enough to propel a 2-ton car to highway speeds instantly. You cannot build a modern high-performance EV motor without neodymium magnets.
And it's not just cars, right?
No, it extends to nearly all advanced infrastructure. High-yield generators inside offshore wind turbines require massive quantities of these magnets. The miniaturized guidance systems and actuators inside advanced defense missiles rely on them. Our entire clean energy and advanced defense transition is predicated on access to these specific rare earth magnets.
And where does India currently source its neodymium magnets?
Currently, India imports virtually 100% of its requirements for high-grade REPMs. And worse, from a strategic and geopolitical standpoint, one single nation, China, controls over 90% of the global production and refining capacity for these specific rare earth magnets.
That is a terrifying bottleneck. In a geopolitical crisis, if China decides to halt exports of REPMs, the global transition to electric vehicles simply grinds to a halt. The manufacturing of wind turbines stops. The defense supply chains freeze. We would be trading our reliance on the Strait of Hormuz for oil for a reliance on a single strategic rival for technology.
That is the exact strategic trap the government is trying to avoid. The REPM scheme is a targeted production-linked incentive. The government is aiming to build a domestic manufacturing capacity of 20,000 tons of these magnets annually by 2030 to achieve Atmanirbhar, or self-reliance, in advanced materials.
But wait, if we're going to manufacture the magnets here, where do the actual raw rare earth minerals come from? Are we just going to import the raw dirt from China instead of the finished magnet? Do we even have these minerals in India?
We do. India actually possesses significant deposits of rare earth elements. They are primarily found in the monazite sands along the beaches of Kerala, particularly in the Chavara region. There are also substantial inland deposits in Jharkhand, Rajasthan, and Andhra Pradesh.
So if we have the sand, why aren't we making the magnets already?
Because digging up the sand is the easy part. The challenge lies in the metallurgy. The chemical engineering required to separate specific rare earth elements, like neodymium and praseodymium, from the radioactive thorium in the ore, refine them to a high purity, and then precisely sinter them with iron and boron into high-grade magnets is incredibly complex, highly toxic, and technologically guarded.
It requires a massive leap in industrial capability.
Exactly. The extended global tender for the REPM scheme is designed to attract global technology partners, companies from Japan, South Korea, or the West that possess this refining technology, to joint venture with Indian firms. The goal is to jumpstart that refining and manufacturing capability domestically, finally securing the supply chain from the beach sand in Kerala all the way to the motor in an Indian-made electric vehicle.
What an incredible intellectual journey today. We have covered a staggering amount of ground in this deep dive. We started with the terrifying physics of doublet earthquakes in Venezuela and the absolute necessity of early warning systems. We navigated the dark constitutional history of the emergency and celebrated how the judiciary eventually secured the fundamental right to life. We rode along with the NITRA AEW&C, examining the physics of AISI radars, extending our vision across borders, while detailing how the new IB chief defends our internal security from the shadows.
We unpacked the complex constitutional mechanisms of Article 262 to understand why states fight so bitterly over the Mahde River, and we analyzed the delicate, heavily debated balance required in regulating foreign funding under the FCRA. We saw the profound reality of a simple NIPT blood test rendering decades of ultrasound laws obsolete, and watched the CCPA force desperately needed honesty onto the front of our grocery store packaging.
We confronted the systemic tragedy of our inadequate level eye trauma care infrastructure and the institutionalized corruption causing fatal fires in our construction sector. And finally, we tracked the massive forces shaping our economic future, from the RBI utilizing AI to revolutionize digital fraud liability, to the geopolitics of the Strait of Hormuz dictating the BRICS clean energy agenda and our local LPG supply, culminating in the high-stakes strategic race to manufacture rare earth permanent magnets. All these seemingly disparate dots connect. Geography dictates security. Technology continually disrupts the law, and the relentless pursuit of energy runs it all.
Understanding the deep mechanisms of how these elements interact, the physics, the law, the economics, is the true essence of being genuinely well-informed.
And as we wrap up today's analysis, I want to leave you with one final lingering thought to mull over. Throughout every segment of this deep dive, we witnessed a powerful recurring theme. Technology is vastly, almost violently, outpacing the speed of law. Non-invasive genomic blood tests are rendering established sex selection laws entirely obsolete. AI-driven social engineering scams are forcing the central bank to hastily rewrite decades-old rules of banking liability. Advanced material science is shifting global monopolies faster than international trade deals can adapt. So, here's the question for you to consider as you go about your day. Will human governance, legislation, and bureaucracy ever learn to anticipate and move at the speed of human innovation? Or are our legal and regulatory systems forever destined to just play a desperate, reactive game of catch-up? Think about it. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the sources, and we will see you next time.